They say every family writes its own scripture in silence, and every wedding is the ritual that exposes it. You think you're walking into love, but what you're really stepping into is the altar of inheritance, the kind built not with candles and flowers, but with invisible contracts written long before you were born. At my wedding, the air shimmered with sweetness and lies, the kind of perfume that clings to lace, to breath, to memory. Cameras flashed like lightning before a storm. And then, through that blur of celebration, I heard her voice, calm, soft, surgical. You won't be keeping his parents' car. 8 words, polite, ordinary. Yet something ancient moved beneath them, the old machinery of control humming quietly behind every family smile. The guests laughed, unaware. But inside me, something cracked. That sentence wasn't about a car. It was a spell, a reminder of ownership, hierarchy, and power dressed as kindness. My mother's smile had always been a seal, a signature that said, "You still belong to me." Every man in the room kept eating. Every woman kept smiling. That's how control survives, through performance, through manners, through the illusion that obedience is love. I remember thinking how beautiful it all looked from the outside. The music, the laughter, the delicate choreography of loyalty. And I realized that's what families, governments, and institutions all master first, the art of making submission look holy. The moment stretched. Her words hung between us like smoke that wouldn't fade. My groom's hand tightened around mine, steady but silent. He understood, not the car, not the insult, but the revelation. I had never been free. And maybe that's what every ritual hides. Beneath the flowers and vows, there's always an exchange. One side giving something, the other claiming ownership of it. That day, under the music and applause, I felt something watching, ancient and impersonal. Not God, not fate. Just the endless repetition of power handed down through smiles. That's where the story begins, where beauty becomes the mask, and obedience becomes the price of belonging. Every system of control begins with something that feels like love. It never calls itself ownership, or hierarchy, or power. It starts with a mother's smile, a teacher's approval, a leader's promise. That's how the leash is braided, out of comfort. When I looked at my mother that day, I realized she wasn't the architect of cruelty. She was the priest of a doctrine she didn't know she served. Her calm tone, her soft authority, those were relics, passed down like wedding silver. Every generation inherits its own form of obedience and calls it tradition. I saw the same structure everywhere, in offices where praise replaced pay, in friendships built on apology, in governments that traded safety for silence. Control doesn't need cages when it teaches you to build them yourself. The trick is simple. Convince a person that peace depends on their cooperation. Once they believe that, you can take anything. Their time, their car, their voice. They'll even thank you for the privilege. That night, after the wedding, I lay awake hearing her words over and over. You won't be keeping his parents' car. It echoed like scripture rewritten in a language of debt. I understood then that my whole life had been a curriculum in compliance. Every compliment had been a test, every small surrender a rehearsal. But awareness is a dangerous gift. Once you see the structure, you can never unsee it. The world tilts, faces rearrange themselves into masks you recognize. You start noticing who smiles when you shrink. You start remembering how many times you've called surrender kindness. And beneath that noticing, a question begins to form, a quiet, disobedient whisper. What if love isn't obedience at all? What if love is the moment you stop being useful to someone's illusion and still choose to stand? The thought frightened me. It also felt oxygen. That's how awakening begins, not with fire, but with a breath you weren't supposed to take. Resistance doesn't announce itself. It begins as a flicker, small, inconvenient, almost tender. The mind tests it like a forbidden word on the tongue. You taste it, then hide it. That's how it was for me in the days after the wedding. Everyone smiled the same, everyone spoke as though nothing had happened. But the air had changed. The sound of my mother's voice still lived in the corners of every room, reminding me how easily I could be rewritten. For a while, I played my part. Dutiful daughter, gracious bride, the same mask shaped by years of polite survival. That's the first rule of quiet rebellion. Never let them see the tremor before the storm. You learn to nod at the right times, to smile through the rot. Because control depends on visibility. If they can't see the disobedience, they can't crush it. I began watching instead of speaking. I saw how my mother organized conversations like battlefields, who spoke first, who yielded, and who received praise. I saw how my sister learned power through mimicry, how my father floated between us like a ghost wearing patience as armor. And I saw how easily love can become choreography, every movement rehearsed to keep peace from collapsing. That's when I realized rebellion wasn't anger. It was clarity. To resist, I didn't need to scream. I only needed to stop playing their music. That's the truth tyrants of any size fear most, silence that doesn't obey. At night, I would sit by the window tracing the pattern of city lights, each one a cell in a vast organism of obedience, people working, serving, hoping, repeating. The system didn't need violence, it needed routine, and I had been a faithful participant. Awakening is not beautiful. It's disorienting, lonely, and raw. When you begin to see the machinery of control, you also see how much of yourself you've offered to keep it running. Your own reflection starts to look like a stranger who betrayed you politely. But somewhere between grief and clarity, I made a promise. I would stop feeding the illusion. I would study it, name it, and one day dismantle it. It is a strange thing, the moment you begin to map what once felt personal onto the world itself. You start seeing your family's grammar of control echoed in everything that holds power, offices, pulpits, newsrooms, and even the quiet corridors of memory. The patterns repeat, soft words, subtle fear, and a promise that obedience will keep you safe. When I studied my mother, I learned how entire institutions survive. She never shouted, she smiled. She didn't demand, she offered choices already decided. That is how most systems work. They teach you that harmony depends on your cooperation, that dissent is selfish. They tell you that safety is purchased through silence. I began reading history differently then, not as dates and wars, but as choreography. Empires rise when people mistake comfort for freedom. They fall when someone finally stops applauding. Even the smallest household rehearses this dance, we just rename it tradition. My wedding had been a pageant of those invisible contracts. Every toast is a reaffirmation of hierarchy, every blessing a demand to conform. When my mother announced the gift transfer, she wasn't being cruel. She was preserving the order. In her mind, the world stayed balanced only if everyone remained where she'd placed them. I used to think corruption meant greed, but it's gentler than that. It's the slow erosion of truth under the weight of good manners. It's the meeting that begins with gratitude and ends with concession. It's the smile that hides extraction. Once you see it, the world begins to shimmer with double meanings. The word family can mean control. Loyalty can mean fear. Respect can mean silence. And love, used often enough, can mean surrender. But clarity is not enough. It demands a unseenom. You can't unsee the stagecraft once you've glimpsed behind the curtain. And yet to speak too early is to lose your voice before you find it. So I waited, watching the architecture of obedience with a calm that felt like danger. Every structure, from a family to a nation, depends on unspoken consent. Take that away, and even the most beautiful illusion begins to crumble. Reclaiming power isn't a declaration. It's a withdrawal. You stop feeding what once defined you. You stop volunteering for your own containment. That's how it began for me. Quietly. I didn't announce rebellion. I simply stopped explaining myself. The first silence felt unnatural, almost rude. Years of conditioning had trained me to justify every breath, every choice, every flicker of independence. But I learned something. The moment you stop explaining, the architecture of control begins to lose its shape. My mother noticed it first. Her questions sharpened, her smiles grew brittle. She would say, "You've changed." And I would reply, "Yes, nothing more. People who rely on your compliance mistake your stillness for hostility. But stillness is where the power returns. It's the pause between reaction and command. The space where you start choosing what deserves your energy. I began making small decisions that carried quiet weight. I drove the car that wasn't mine, not as defiance but as reclamation. Every turn of the wheel whispered a truth. Ownership is not about possession, it's about refusal to be erased. When I visited home, I brought my own silence like a mirror. It reflected everything they had taught me and refused to repeat it. In that silence, I found strategy. I learned that resistance isn't about fighting louder. It's about changing the rhythm. When you stop dancing to someone else's song, the music loses its spell. That's when those around you begin to falter, unsure of their steps. The family system tried to lure me back with guilt, with nostalgia, with the promise of peace. But peace built on submission is just a prettier name for control. So I waited. I let the silence grow, and in that space, something unexpected happened. I began to hear myself again. My own voice, untrained and uneven, but real. The sound of someone learning not just to resist, but to exist. Awakening alone is only the beginning, it's the rehearsal before the real work. The moment you start to live differently, the world reacts as if you've broken an unspoken treaty. Every person who once depended on your compliance will test you, plead with you, or accuse you of arrogance. That's how you know you're changing something real. At first, I wanted only distance, space to breathe, to hear myself without echoes. But silence has gravity. It draws attention. People began to ask, "How are you so calm?" Or "Why doesn't this bother you anymore?" And I saw in their eyes the same quiet hunger that once lived in mine, a longing to be unafraid. I told them the truth, softly, without sermons, that fear is learned, that peace doesn't come from obedience but from understanding the cost of it, that sometimes love means letting illusions collapse, even if it hurts. It's strange how rebellion spreads, not through shouting but through example. Someone watches you refuse to apologize for existing, and they begin to wonder if they could do the same. Someone sees you stay silent when provoked, and they realize silence can be strength, not surrender. Change passes from person to person like a quiet contagion of self-respect. In that small circle of awakening, we didn't talk about revenge or justice. We talked about returning to our own names, our own boundaries, our own right to feel without permission. We learned to recognize the tricks, the compliments that were really corrections, the favors that were really leashes. Each realization was a key. Each truth unlocked another cell. I didn't become a leader. Leaders create followers. That's just another hierarchy. I became something smaller, an echo of permission, a reminder that it's possible to stand without asking. Freedom doesn't arrive like lightning. It seeps in like light under a locked door. Slow, patient, undeniable. You start by noticing it. Then you begin to open the door wider, until one day the room that held you no longer feels like home. Freedom never begins with fireworks. It begins with a decision so small, it almost feels like nothing. But that's how power moves. Quietly, decisively, without needing applause. For me, it happened on a morning that looked ordinary. The sky was gray, the air heavy with that pre-storm stillness. I stood in front of the car, the same one my mother said I'd never keep. It gleamed faintly under the weak light, like a relic of someone else's life. And for the first time, I didn't see a gift or a debt. I saw a choice. The keys felt different in my hand. They no longer symbolized rebellion. They simply belonged there. I started the engine not to run away, but to leave the orbit of old permission. Every turn of the tires felt like erasing a sentence someone else had written for me. There was no dramatic goodbye, no confrontation. I didn't need witnesses. The truest acts of liberation rarely have an audience. They exist between the inhale of decision and the exhale of peace. As I drove, the world looked both new and familiar. The same roads, the same signs, yet everything carried new weight. I realized that freedom isn't about distance. It's about direction. And mine finally was my own. I didn't know where I was going, but for the first time, uncertainty didn't terrify me. It felt clean, like unmarked paper. Behind me was inheritance, ahead of me, authorship. That car, once a symbol of obedience, became something else entirely. Not a trophy, not a possession, but proof that I could redefine meaning itself. Control had written its story over my life for too long. Now I was writing mine, line by line, breath by breath. Freedom isn't loud. It's not even certain. It's the quiet conviction that you will never again trade truth for approval. And in that conviction, everything changes. Freedom, I've learned, isn't an escape. It's a return. A homecoming to the self you were before fear taught you to behave. When I look back now, I don't hate my mother. I understand her. She wasn't my enemy. She was the mirror of every generation that mistook control for care. She handed me her lessons like heirlooms, not knowing they were chains. And maybe that's the most human thing of all, to pass down both love and limitation, hoping the next one will learn the difference. I did, and that's the quiet revolution. Not in burning bridges, but in walking past them with grace. We think freedom means shouting no. Sometimes it means whispering enough. Sometimes it means not answering at all. The car, the wedding, the smile, they were never the story. They were symbols, small theaters where power rehearsed itself. The real story began the moment I chose to stop performing. Every person will meet that moment differently. For some, it comes as heartbreak. For others, it's the silence after years of pretending. But it always begins the same way, with one clear thought: I don't need permission to exist as myself. And when you reach that thought, everything small and sacred inside you starts to breathe again. You notice the weight of your own footsteps. You feel the ground as something that belongs to you, not to those who named it before you. The world stops feeling like a stage and starts feeling like soil. That's when you know you're no longer surviving someone else's story. You're writing your own. Not perfectly, not loudly, but truly. And in that quiet truth, the kind that doesn't need validation or applause, lies the rarest kind of vengeance. Peace.